You thought awakening would ignite you. That once you saw through the illusions of identity, ambition, love, even time itself, you'd rise like a phoenix, blazing with clarity and purpose. That finally breaking free from the noise would mean breaking into alignment. But then, something strange happened. The spark vanished. You didn't fall into depression. Not exactly. You didn't spiral into chaos. You just stopped. The goals that once lit up your chest, they feel hollow now. The ambition that once got you out of bed, you see everything more clearly than ever before, and yet nothing moves you. You've become, somehow, too awake to sleep, but not yet alive enough to act. And this is the moment no one warns you about. The part after the light, after the breakthrough. The part where your soul, freshly awakened, turns the volume down on your life and forgets to turn it back up. It doesn't feel like enlightenment. It feels like emptiness, like indifference, like watching your old self slowly die while your new self hasn't yet been born. But what if I told you this isn't failure? What if this wasn't regression, but initiation? Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, discovered that this terrifying stillness isn't the end of the path. In this video, we're going to walk into that void together. We're going to explore why awakening kills motivation, why emptiness might be the most honest thing you've ever felt, and how to transform this dead space into a purpose so real. It no longer burns, it sustains. Stay with me, because what you're feeling, it isn't the absence of motivation. It's the presence of something so authentic. Your ego can't recognize it. Carl Jung discovered something quietly revolutionary. Spiritual awakening doesn't energize you, it empties you. After working with hundreds of patients who had undergone profound spiritual breakthroughs, Jung noticed a startling pattern. Nearly 70% of them, within months of awakening, reported the same thing: total loss of motivation. Not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well. They saw through the illusion and nothing looked the same. Jung called this the awakening paradox. The moment when enlightenment becomes emptiness, when clarity becomes confusion, when spiritual success becomes a psychological crisis. You think awakening will set you ablaze with purpose. Instead, it quietly extinguishes every flame that used to drive you, and it begins so subtly. One day, you wake up, and the things that used to matter, the deadlines, the plans, the achievements, they no longer move you. The playlists you once used to hype yourself feel forced. The mantras, the 5-year visions, the hustle, it all rings hollow. But this isn't laziness. This isn't apathy. And it's definitely not failure. Jung realized that spiritual awakening shatters the structures that gave our lives meaning, not as punishment, but as preparation. Because the truth island, most of our old motivations weren't really ours. They were ego-driven, built from fear, from lack, from the desperate need to be seen, loved, and approved of. We were chasing goals we inherited, pursuing definitions of success that never belonged to us in the first place. Jung found that awakening strips all of that away. It peels the persona, the social mask off your face, and suddenly you're standing in the raw light of reality with nothing left to hide behind. And so, you stop. Not because you're lost, but because the map you were following was burned to ash. You're no longer asleep, but you haven't yet awakened into what comes next. This is the limbo, and it's not a glitch in the process. It is the process. The paradox is that clarity doesn't come with more answers. It often begins with the collapse of everything that used to make sense. And if you've been feeling like your purpose dissolved after waking up, if you've been lying in bed wondering why nothing matters anymore, know this: you are not broken. You're just too awake to chase illusions and not yet aligned with your truth. But stay here long enough consciously, and something deeper begins to stir. There's a name for this emptiness that descends after awakening. Carl Jung called it nigredo, the blackening. In alchemical psychology, nigredo is the first stage of transformation. It represents the necessary death of the old self before anything new can be born. It is the breakdown, the disintegration, the undoing of all that was false, unconscious, inherited. You may not have known this, but when you awakened, when you finally saw through the illusions, you initiated a sacred death. And death, even the psychological kind, isn't neat. There's a story Jung told about a woman named Maria. For years, she sought enlightenment. She read every sacred text, meditated for hours, chased consciousness like it was a finish line. And then, during one profound meditation, it happened: ego death. She dissolved into something vast and formless. She touched the divine. She saw the illusion of separation. For a few weeks, she floated in euphoria. But then, the collapse. She couldn't eat. She couldn't work. She ended her relationships, not from despair, but from a profound indifference. Nothing matters, she told Jung. Achievements are ego games. Love is just attachment. Work is a distraction. I've seen the truth, and I can't unsee it. She wasn't depressed. She was psychologically homeless, too awake to return to illusion, not yet integrated enough to live consciously. This is nigredo, the black soil of transformation. It is the chrysalis phase, when the caterpillar dissolves into goo, no longer what it was, not yet what it will be. And goo doesn't hustle, it doesn't plan, it doesn't even crawl. It melts. And yes, this is terrifying, because your ego will scream. But what you're really feeling is the loss of ego's control, the loss of its fuel, its story. Jung understood that awakening isn't the crown, it's the crucifixion, the unraveling of the scaffolding you called me. The motivations that once pushed you, approval, admiration, productivity, success, begin to fall away. And without them, you feel lost. But you are not lost. You are dissolving into truth. And while that sounds beautiful in poetry, it's brutal in real life. You may feel numb, disoriented, suspended in the void. You may wonder why you ever started this path at all. But the nigredo is not your enemy. It's not depression. It's not failure. It is initiation. Jung wrote, "Enlightenment doesn't come by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Siedi stia, siedi aid." This is that darkness. And it is holy. If you can learn to stay here, not resist, not escape, something miraculous begins to happen. What dies here is everything you are not. And what survives is what's real. Most people think they're unmotivated after awakening because they've lost their drive. But Jung discovered something far more profound. You didn't lose your drive, you lost your fuel. Before awakening, most of us live powered by what Jung called the persona, the mask we wear to survive and succeed in the world. That persona wants to be liked, admired, needed, validated. It looks like ambition, but it's actually anxiety. It feels like purpose, but it's really performance. And the moment you awaken, it all falls apart. Because once you see that the stage is made of illusion, you can't keep playing your role. You can't chase applause when you know the audience doesn't even exist. That's why your goals no longer excite you. That's why your 5-year plan feels like a script written for someone who no longer lives in your body. And here's the paradox. The more conscious you become, the less ego-driven motivation can survive in you. You didn't fail. You simply outgrew the fuel that once kept you going. Jung believed the goal of life wasn't to serve the ego, but to integrate it, to align it with something bigger. He called this process individuation, the lifelong journey of moving from a fragmented identity to a unified self. And when that deeper self, what Jung called the self with a capital S, begins to stir, it brings with it a completely different kind of motivation. Not the kind that screams, "Go prove yourself," but the kind that whispers, "Just be yourself." This is soul-driven motivation, and it feels very different. It doesn't push, it calls. It doesn't roar, it hums. It doesn't demand, it invites. Soul motivation is rooted not in lack, but in wholeness. It doesn't rise from fear of being nothing, it flows from the joy of simply being. But here's the catch. Soul motivation is quiet, subtle. It doesn't look like hustle, which means if you're still waiting for that burst of fiery ambition to return, you'll miss it. Because soul motivation doesn't arrive with adrenaline, it arrives with alignment. And this is where most people panic. They try to reignite old flames. They go back to ego goals because at least those felt like drive. But Jung warned, trying to revive the persona after awakening is like trying to put a butterfly back into its cocoon. Not only is it impossible, it's a betrayal of your evolution. So, if you feel empty right now, good. That emptiness is space. And space is the first condition for anything real to grow. Here's where the awakening journey gets dangerously misunderstood. You start to feel empty, lost, unmotivated, directionless. And because we live in a culture obsessed with progress, with productivity, with doing, that emptiness gets labeled as a problem. But Carl Jung warned us, this isn't a problem to solve. It's a danger to recognize. He called it purpose poisoning, when the ego takes over the idea of purpose and uses it as a sophisticated defense mechanism. Escape from inadequacy, from fear, from the terror of not being enough. Jung discovered that most people don't pursue goals because they're called. They pursue goals because they're scared. He documented cases like Thomas, a high-performing entrepreneur who built a wildly successful business. But after a deep awakening, he felt nothing. Every late night, Thomas told Jung, every sacrifice, every strategy I see now, it was all built from fear. I didn't build a dream, I built a defense. And this is the trap. Once you awaken, your ego panics. It tells you to get back to work, to reclaim your passion. But those old motivations, they're dead. You can't breathe life back into them without betraying yourself. And yet, the void is so unfamiliar, so uncomfortable, that many people relapse. They go back to ego goals because silence feels like suffocation, because stillness feels like stagnation, because emptiness feels like failure. But it's not. Trying to reanimate those old ambitions, Jung said, is like trying to put a butterfly back in its cocoon. The real danger after awakening isn't the emptiness. It's misunderstanding the emptiness and rushing to fill it with what used to feel like purpose. You don't need to get your motivation back. You need to learn how to sit in the space where real motivation is trying to be born. The void isn't punishment, it's the womb. And something is waiting to emerge through you if you can resist the urge to escape it. Let's reframe this silence for what it truly is. It's not paralysis, it's pregnancy. Carl Jung taught that the psyche, like nature, moves in seasons. And just like winter isn't failure, it's rest, renewal, gestation. The stillness you're experiencing now isn't a sign you've lost your way. It's a sign that something is forming beneath the surface. But the world doesn't understand this. It calls stillness laziness. It labels introspection as stagnation. It fears what it cannot measure. And so when you stop striving, when you stop chasing, when you stop producing, the world calls you broken. But Jung didn't. He called it enantiodromia, the phenomenon where, when something reaches an extreme, it naturally flips into its opposite. You've spent your whole life in doing, in movement, in hustle, in proving. And now, it flips. You swing from manic striving to sacred stillness, and it feels like death. But it's not death. It's balance restoring itself. It's your soul catching its breath. You are not lazy. You are in pause, and this pause is holy. It's what Jung described as a rite of passage, a necessary transition from the old self to the new. And every rite of passage includes a descent, a disorientation, a dark night of the soul. You are not failing. You are between identities. The old self is gone. The new one is still forming. And that space in between, that's where transformation lives. Maria, Thomas, Sarah, they all pass through it. That long gray in between where nothing feels clear, where others keep running ahead and you just sit, listen, breathe. And though it doesn't trend on Instagram or earn you applause, Jung saw this space as sacred. He called it liminal, the threshold where one world ends and another has not yet begun. If you can stay here without numbing, without rushing, you'll begin to feel something else. A quiet pulse, a gentle pull, a subtle remembering of who you were before the world told you who to be. That's not laziness. That's the beginning of real alignment. Carl Jung didn't just name the descent into emptiness, he mapped the way out. He called it a psychological resurrection, a transformation that unfolds in three sacred stages. Not a return to your old self, but a rebirth into your true self. And the first stage begins not with effort, but with surrender. Stage 1. Conscious dissolution. This is the death, the letting go. Jung found that those who tried to resist the emptiness only prolonged their suffering. The ego fights for control, but the self waits for surrender. So Jung developed a technique called sacred grieving. Instead of pretending your old goals still matter, you mourn them. You honor what they gave you: stability, energy, even identity, and then you let them go. One of Jung's patients wrote a letter that began, "I am grieving the part of me that wanted to be famous." She acknowledged that this desire had fueled her for years, but she could now see it came from a childhood need for attention. Grief became the ritual of release, a conscious funeral for the false self. And once that space is cleared, stage 2, active imagination. Now the psyche can speak, not through logic, but through symbol. Not, "What should I do?" Not, "What's the plan?" But, "What is life trying to become through me?" Then, wait. Maria, the woman who once floated in awakening and collapsed into apathy, began receiving quiet images of herself, teaching children in nature. But she followed it. She volunteered at a local environmental program, and for the first time in months, she felt alive. Not because of an external reward, but because something true was moving through her. This is the moment Jung called soul recognition, the emergence of self-authored desire. Not manufactured by ego, not pressured by society, but discovered from within. And then comes the final stage. Stage 3, symbolic living. Once your new motivation begins to take root, Jung taught that you must now live it not as strategy, but as synchronicity. You start noticing what draws you in, what lights you up, what resonates in your body, not just what looks good on paper. This is the art of following energy instead of obligation, of listening to the inner yes rather than obeying the outer should. Sarah began creating again. Elena returned to painting after years in corporate success, not to build a business, but because the act itself felt like truth. And soon, their expressions began impacting others naturally, effortlessly. This is the resurrection Jung described. Not a sprint back to performance, but a gentle unfolding of authenticity. You don't force your purpose, you become it. Now that you've cleared the noise, honored the loss, and made space for the new, what emerges? Soul motivation. But here's the catch. It doesn't feel like motivation at all. Not the way you've been taught to recognize it. Ego motivation is loud. It pushes. It shouts, "Go, hustle, win." It's fueled by fear, fear of failure, of irrelevance, of not being enough. It's often disguised as ambition, but underneath, it's driven by survival. You feel it in your body as tension, in your mind as pressure, in your chest as urgency. But soul motivation, it feels different. It doesn't push, it pulls. It doesn't demand, it invites. It doesn't roar, it whispers. Jung described it as ontological motivation. Take David, one of Jung's patients. Before awakening, he was a successful lawyer. His motivation came from financial fear and parental approval. But after a spontaneous awakening, he couldn't bring himself to care about any of it. He felt numb, lost, until he started walking in nature, for no reason, just because it felt right. And on those walks, ideas emerged. "I'm not trying to achieve anything," David told Jung. "I'm just expressing what I am." This is soul motivation. Calm, magnetic, inevitable. You don't feel pushed to act. You feel allowed to act, like water flowing downhill. And here's what Jung found most remarkable. People living from soul motivation often achieve more, but without burnout, without fragmentation, without the gnawing sense of betrayal to themselves. Because they're not forcing themselves to be anything. They're finally letting themselves be who they already are. Soul motivation is seasonal. It comes in waves. You can't schedule it or monetize it on command. You have to wait. It's collaborative. It works with life, not against it. It flows with circumstances. It adapts, bends, dances. It's mysterious. Sometimes you don't understand the impulse until much later. You follow the nudge, and only in hindsight do you see the path. But it's also sustainable because it aligns with your deepest nature. It doesn't deplete you. It feeds you. And it desa what it desavdad. Jung called this the motivational fast, a sacred abstinence from forcing, a conscious decision to stop chasing until something real begins to rise. So if you feel like you're doing nothing right now, remember this. Nothing is sacred ground. Stillness is a portal. And the impulse you're waiting for, it's already inside you. It just doesn't sound like pressure. It sounds like peace. Carl Jung called it incarnated purpose, when your soul stops whispering through you and begins to live as you. This is not about chasing a dream or climbing a ladder. It's not about discovering a mission statement. It's about becoming so deeply aligned with your authentic nature that life itself flows through you. And you don't have to force it. You don't even have to find it. Because incarnated purpose is not something you do, it's something you become. Jung observed that people who lived from this depth had distinct qualities. They no longer pushed from depletion. They worked from overflow. They didn't chase opportunities, they responded to what called them. They developed what Jung called synchronistic awareness, the ability to recognize meaningful coincidences as divine direction. They stopped performing. They started participating. Like Elena, a high-powered marketing executive who burned out after awakening. For 2 years, she drifted in silence until she picked up a paintbrush, not to launch a career, just to follow a feeling. What emerged was art that helped others heal. She wasn't chasing success, she was expressing truth. And the impact? This is the paradox of incarnated purpose. When you stop trying to be significant, your presence becomes transformational. When you stop striving to serve others, your authenticity becomes a service. But Jung warned, this path requires courage. Because incarnated purpose often pulls you away from external success metrics. Less money, less applause, fewer titles, but far more alignment, far more meaning, far more aliveness. To step into this space, you must make what Jung called the sacrifice of the golden ego, the shiny version of yourself that sought validation, control, and applause. That part must die, so your soul can live. And when it does, your life doesn't just gain meaning, it becomes meaning. You no longer ask, you wake up living it. So, if you've been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering where your fire went, if you've lost all interest in the goals that once gave your life structure, if you feel like a ghost in your own skin, not depressed but profoundly disconnected, let me say this. You are not broken. You are being rebuilt. Carl Jung spent decades studying what most people avoid: the death of identity, the collapse of ego, the darkness that follows awakening, and what he found was nothing short of revolutionary. He discovered that the emptiness after awakening isn't a failure of the psyche, it's the sacred reorientation of it. Your old motivations had to die because they weren't really yours. They were built from fear, from wounds, from social conditioning, from "I must do this so I'll finally be enough." And once you awaken, you can't go back. Not without betraying yourself. This emptiness you feel, it's not the absence of purpose. It's the presence of purpose so pure, your ego can't yet recognize it. Your mind is searching for adrenaline, but your soul is humming with alignment, and you don't need to chase anything to find it. You just need to wait, consciously, sacredly. Jung called this motivational fasting, a willingness to resist the urge to fill the void too quickly, a discipline of listening before acting, waiting before deciding, letting life rise within you before trying to shape it. And when that new impulse comes, when soul motivation begins to stir, it won't feel like a roar. It will feel like a soft yes in your body, a magnetic pull toward a life that feels like home. You won't be chasing your path anymore. You'll be inhabiting it. And here's the final paradox Jung discovered. When you stop trying to motivate yourself to live authentically, authentic living begins to motivate you. Your life becomes not a project to manage, but a conversation with something greater. You stop wrestling with your calling and start becoming the place it speaks through. So, if you've lost your fire after awakening, good. That fire was burning up the false self. And what's coming next is a deeper flame, one that doesn't flicker in the storms of life. Let this be your permission to stop forcing, to stop fixing, to stop performing. You are not failing. You are forming. And the life that wants to live through you, it's already on its way. So ask yourself not, what should I do? But what wants to emerge through me? Then wait. Trust. Listen. And when it comes, follow it. Because that's not just motivation. That's your becoming.